Well, the question I want to address in this second bit is, what other questions can we ask if we're going to take this notion of comparative diabology seriously? And I think it's been neglected. I mean, it's unmentionable. Nobody in polite academic circles wants to talk about the devil, with any degree of attention. But I think that from a peace studies perspective, we have to. Because there's an awful lot of people out there literally taking the devil seriously and using it to justify a lot of violence. So that's just one very good reason why we have to take it seriously.
Can I just say one thing there? And take advantage of that. That's the bit that I see over and over again, where there's like this polarity between good and evil.
Right.
That allows another group, who I would consider genuinely evil, to take advantage of that situation and use that. Lots can be got away with because there's people polarising everything all the time. That's how, how it looks to me. I just want to put that in there.
Can you save that as a question for the end?
Yeah.
I want you to ask the question about, especially sort of your research on satanic groups who are practicing.
Okay.
Can you formulate that as a question? Because that's very important. And we'll come back to that. So that's one question we can ask in terms of comparative diabology, actually. And I will come back to that later, but if you can ask it as a specific question, I'd appreciate it. One question I want to ask is, as you've probably gathered from my talk so far, I'm very interested in esoteric history. Now, there's only one centre in Britain, at the University of Exeter, where you can do a degree or master's degree in esoteric history. Founded by Nicholas Goodrick Clark, who's unfortunately died now. And there's a brilliant encyclopedia of esoteric thought in the West, edited by a Dutch scholar. They do this work in Amsterdam. So a lot of people have looked at esotericism and Eastern thought, like Buddhism and Hinduism and things, for many, many years. But in the Western tradition, it's quite new. So looking at things like 19th century Victorian esotericism, things like the Golden Dawn, things like the occult, people that came out of the Golden Dawn, like Crowley, who I mentioned before, the history of Freemasonry in European society as well. Also the history of what some people call pan-sophism, this 17th century idea of universal restoration of goodness from the fall. This was an idea that Francis Bacon had when he launched a scientific method. He was a pan-sophist. They wanted to redeem mankind through knowledge. John Dee had the same idea. He was an Elizabethan esotericist. And this also inspired the origins of Freemasonry. So, there's a whole history of the origins of science which is connected with esoteric philosophy that I think needs looking at. And this split between science and spirituality and religion, I think is a false split. They're both doing the same kind of work. If you're dying, if one of us in this room has a heart attack and we send for the doctor will come in and check your vital signs, do whatever's necessary, give you a drug. But your wife or your husband or your friend will also be whispering in your ear, it's okay, love, you're okay. Love. The spiritual bit is the intangible bit that goes with the physical. They're both important. And you will heal better if someone does that spiritual bit. This is why... So I think the split between science and religion is totally bogus, and it's a kind of schizophrenia that our society suffers from. And it can only be healed if we reclaim our own esoteric history. And this is what I've been doing for the last 30 years, by looking into the history of esoteric thought in depth. Both inside academia and privately. One thing that's very interesting is Hegel's role in this as a philosopher. This is something I want to flag up. Hegel was probably the most learned philosopher of the 19th century, and he inspired Marx. Marx never met him, but he sat at the feet of everybody that had in Berlin, where he went to study at university. And Hegel amassed all the then known knowledge of all different religions and philosophies. He was an absolute polymath. He knew about Eastern religion, Western religion, all different kinds of Christianity and everything. But he also deeply studied esoteric thought. Hegel was deeply versed in the Kabbalah, in Sufism, in Jacob Boehme, He was friends with Freemasons. He was milling around in all kinds of esoteric currents. And what Hegel was trying to do was put them all together into a grand synthesis. The difference between a philosopher and an esotericist is the esotericist sort of gathers the knowledge but sort of sits with it privately and spreads it privately. A bit like the mystery schools of antiquity, okay? But the philosopher takes on the extra public role of sharing that publicly and trying to give it away, you know. And I think that's what Hegel was trying to do in his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. In a sense, if you can somehow penetrate that book, what he's talking about mystical consciousness becoming aware of itself, you know, through human consciousness, and it's a masterpiece of esoteric thought. Now, this inspired Marxism, and it's a current within Marxist thought. So that all needs to be studied, I think, and the universalizing principles that are there. We can also go further back in the history of European esotericism, because there's a current within Christianity known as the Cathar tradition, which was the esoteric dimension of Christianity, which believed in the purification of the soul. Cathar means purity in Greek. Blessed are the pure in heart in Greek. Cathar in kardios, the pure in heart. Now, the Cathar groups of Christians believed in reincarnation. They believed in sort of spiritual struggle for enlightenment. They refused to fight, although they did in the end in self-defense when there was a crusade done against them. But I think it's very interesting, the history of the Cathar tradition, and this tragic clash that occurred in Christian thought between the Catholic Church on the one hand, who regarded them as evil, because what the Cathars were doing was they were actually questioning whether the world might be somehow, you know, a bit evil. And they were like James. They wanted to find purity and get back home. They were like extreme Gnostics. And this created a fear, a split in European society. In a sense, an extreme Gnostic or an extreme Cathar is afraid of the body, afraid of physicality. And matter becomes, as it were, associated with evil. The Catholic position was that, no, embodiment is a grace. Sexuality and marriage are a good thing. You know, you don't have to totally abstain. Embodiment is not something to be ashamed of. It's a grace, a blessing. In Hebrew it's tov, it's good. But what I think is interesting is Marx's understanding of materialism as not necessarily, you know, something that's evil. Dialectical materialism is, in a sense, a statement of fact. We all have bodies in this world. We live in a world of embodiment. Redemption cannot be purely spiritual, therefore. It has to embody and include our physicality. It has to include our, you know, everybody's daily needs. And that, you know, in the Christian prayer, give us our daily bread. You know, that's attend to our physical needs in some way. So I'm just saying that somehow in the history of European thought, this split between spirit and matter has got to be resolved. There's got to be a healing. And something else that needs to be looked at. The Afghan war, I think, was a tragic catastrophe when sort of what might have seemed like some well-meaning Marxist Soviet types were trying to help the Afghans to, you know, come into modernity, and yet finding tremendous resistance, and then a full-blown war with what turned out to be Sunni-inspired Wahhabi, you know, jihadists, and that destabilized, you know, the whole Middle East. And I don't know if you've seen that program Bitter Lake that was on television. There's a lot of reassessment of Saudi's role in contemporary affairs. But there's a very interesting, in my doctoral thesis I looked at the history of anti-communism, because I looked at the Cold War in detail. And I looked at it from both sides. I tried to analyse the rhetoric of, you know, pro-communist and anti-communist, and boy, did they hate each other. And the Saudis were organising anti-atheist alliances of right-wing groups around the planet to really bring down the Soviet system and communism, with the help of American intelligence. And ironically, of course, that the CIA and Western intelligence supported the jihadists against communism, and yet they then turned on them and became the new devil to chase. So I argue in my writing that a critical review of that is needed, and we need to rethink the kind of I call we need to think through a peace policy rather than the war fighting policy. We need thinkers in universities like Oxford and elsewhere to really seriously attend to a peace policy for this country, but also globally, because we can't afford more Afghan wars. And this latest one in Ukraine, I think, again, you can see the demonisation starting. The EU propaganda machine, Putin is absolutely evil and nasty and eats babies, and the Russian propaganda machine against the fascist Ukrainians. And actually, yes, the Ukrainians did support the fascist period in World War II and did help man Auschwitz and so on. So there's some tremendous pain on both sides. I think Britain should be neutral and try to mediate and help resolve these conflicts, not weighing in on one side. And that's what I mean by a peace policy, rather than being seduced into that diabolical rhetoric. So that's kind of where this question impinges on contemporary issues. Just to go back a bit, another question we can ask is, where's the devil image in all the faiths? Nobody's really done a very detailed study of this because it's a bit scary sometimes. But I've talked about it in Hinduism and Buddhism. In Buddhism, Mara is the devil, the tempter, and tries to block Buddha from reaching enlightenment. But actually, it doesn't work. The devil isn't that powerful in Buddhism. If you think it through, you can go beyond. And in Vajrayana Buddhism, the devil is just a projection of your own fears. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, if you see demons and things after death, don't worry, they're just projections of your mind. And you can learn through meditation and stilling of consciousness to allow positive, subjective experiences to be so powerful that the demons just turn into flowers. And I think the West can learn, and this goes back to the phenomenology of consciousness, I think the West can learn a lot from Eastern meditational techniques on transforming demons. Chogyam Trungpa, who was a great Buddhist scholar who worked at Oxford University, he did Buddhist studies and then Western psychology, and he wrote some amazing books about combining the two. If we learn what consciousness is like and transform it from within, then the devils turn into flowers, is the Buddhist approach, which I think is a wise one. Norse religion is interesting. I've not talked about that. I've been very interested in the runes and Norse and Anglo-Saxon religion. They have a devil image in Loki, but Loki isn't really thoroughly, totally evil. He's an interesting character. He's part of the narrative. He just makes mistakes, and he's very human. He's always causing trouble. He's the trickster, but he does bring into being Ragnarok. So Norse religion has a place for the devil.
We still remember one for luck.
What?
We still say, and one for luck, one for Loki.
Is that where it comes from? Seriously?
Yeah.
Is the word luck and the word Loki connected, do you think? That's what
I wasn't aware.
Okay.
But certainly you say one for luck. Loki's
That's interesting.
maker, you say.
Yeah, absolutely. But he has a function. I think in the runic tradition, there's a place for hard-earned knowledge, and even Odin has to go through initiatory tests to gain the knowledge of the runes. And suffering is part of that. Suffering is part of the acquiring of knowledge. So the devil isn't completely and utterly evil. If you've seen that wonderful movie Thor, which is a kind of cinema reconstruction of all that, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's the same in the American Indian religions, which I've written some papers about. They have more a trickster deity. They don't have a thoroughly devilish character, but the American Indians like their tricksters, who are always tripping you up a bit to make you think. And I think that's fine. I mean, where's the humour in this? The devil is, in a sense, the one that makes the story sing along at a good pace. But we've got to have humour in there. And what annoys me about people taking the devil story as the only and really important story, and therefore we have to kill people and behead them, it's as if they've lost the humour. And indeed, I do think that people that, the kind of inquisitional types that are going to torture you if you believe in a devil, they've really lost the plot. They've lost the joke. And we need to get away from that dour seriousness, which is, I think, the problem with the Puritans in the English Civil War as well. Cavaliers I think, had a better sense of humour all round. Okay, I'm going to ask a new question now. What other questions can we ask in comparative diabology? We've asked, was Marx a Satanist? I'm going to be a bit naughty and ask, well, let's go back. Was Moses maybe secretly a Satanist?
A socialist?
No, a Satanist. Because look, Moses killed a man. He was ruthless towards his opponents. He was utterly fixated. And there's a legend in Judaism that God and the devil argue over his soul when he dies, because Satan claimed Moses' soul. Right. Now, there's a tradition in European thought that didn't think Moses was on the very top rung of prophets. He was in league with some dark powers. Machiavelli, who was quite a learned man, didn't like Moses at all. He actually wrote against him and said he was a very junior, not very good prophet, because of all the things that he'd done. One thing he did was he married Zipporah of the Midianite tribe, and then later on, and Jethro, her father, had taken him in and given him succor when he'd fled from killing the Egyptian. And yet later on there was some squabbles, and he had a load of Midianite women killed Moses. He was quite violent towards his enemies. If you stood up against him, you either got burned by fire or you got into trouble. So Freud had a lot to say about Moses, and he would put it down to a psychoanalytical fanaticism of monotheistic belief brought about by Akhenaten, that he had this fixation that he was right and everyone else was wrong. The pagans are wrong because Moses was right. He'd heard the voice coming out of the fire. You could argue that this shows an imbalanced personality, and that
Does that mean he's a Satanist? What's the definition here of a Satanist?
Well, I'm just asking awkward questions. Could it be where Moses thought he was being governed and controlled by the good God, Yahweh? There's a whole tradition of thought that says no, actually, secretly, that was a bad God. Without Moses himself even knowing it, okay, and that this goes back to the struggle between God and the devil, really. It's an interesting question, and I'm going to leave it hanging there.
Can I just throw something into that?
Okay.
In Islam, Moses is the prophet.
Yes.
But he was also. It was suggested that he went and took guidance from Al-Qidra.
I'm coming to that shortly. Yes. Yeah, no, Islam says that Moses was not of the highest rung because he had to be instructed by Al-Qidra.
And he failed the test.
And he failed the test, yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to ask another awkward question. Okay, so Moses, well, we can ask questions about what Moses, where he stands in the hierarchy of good prophets, shall we say. Let's ask about Christ. Let's ask some very difficult and awkward questions. I'm going to ask, was Christ actually secretly a Satanist? Gosh, what a terrible thought. Well, he certainly reified the devil archetype. He's always in communication with Satan. And in a strange way, therefore, wherever Christianity has spread, it's spread knowledge of Satan. Okay. His opponents, Orthodox traditional Jews, accused Christ of being possessed by Satan, Beelzebub, whatever you want to call it. Their allegation, the reason for their wanting to get away Christ out of history as a heretic, they said he's possessed by the devil. Christ, of course, said, no, I'm not, because look, I'm doing all these good deeds, I'm exorcising people, I'm casting devils out. How can I be doing that if I'm possessed by the devil? But actually that argument doesn't really stand up, because if you're casting out little devils, well, obviously you're doing it with the big devil. So it's not a watertight argument. And I wonder, my question is, did Christ ever, sometimes, deep in his mind, think, gosh, maybe I am possessed by the devil? He was walking on water, he was doing all these incredible things. That's kind of strange stuff, yes.
You mentioned briefly about the spread of Christianity with the spread of
knowledge of Satan. Yeah.
Now, I'm not exactly an expert on this because I'm not religious in the slightest, but couldn't that kind of be more the fact that Satan plays a sort of a very inaugural role in Christianity, and you have to believe in, to my understanding, you have to believe in Satan to believe in God, so wouldn't that kind of go hand in hand?
Yeah, but that's the point I'm making. In a sense, you see, if we define Satanist in a broader sense as just someone with knowledge of and a deep interest in the stories, then in a sense Christ is by being so much against Satan, in a strange way, he's actually possibly helping to prolong and create it. Now there's a saying in Rosicrucian Christianity, Christus verus Luciferus. This is a saying that's come down, which means Christ is the true Lucifer, by which they mean the light bringer. Okay. So it's interesting that maybe one burns so hard to be good. Christ was desperately trying to be good and to try and make everything and everyone have a happy ending. That it almost ends up being imbalanced because you're denying the bad. There's what, in a sense, Christ was so good there had to be a Judas appear. There had to be the dark. This was Jung's point, that if you deny the shadow and suppress it will pop up again, with a vengeance. So I'm just asking this question, whether Christ's burning desire for perfection, in a sense ends up creating imperfection because of a neglect of human nature as it is.
I think the difficulty I find is how people have used Christ. It seems to me that spiritual maturity, and I think very much of Ticknell's harm, is to actually recognise the potential for good and evil in each of us. And what we're so often doing is avoiding the evil in us and projecting it onto others. Many people know the Buddhist monk Ticknell's harm, great peace worker, and he had one of his poems about, I am the pirate and I am the girl who's been raped. But that the healing. Yeah. Whereas I think people then use Jesus in this sense, not of trying to be good, because it seems to be trying to be good is false. In one sense, what is healing is to accept the shadow side within. Right. Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing. Yeah, I think we are. In different ways. I'm not just. Yeah. But the question I want to ask is, can we still keep Christianity without the devil? If scientists and we could gather the world's top leading theologians together and they could all agree there isn't a devil, that was just a made-up projection, what would happen to Christianity? Does Christianity need the devil figure in order to justify its own, narrative? I'm going to argue it doesn't. I'm going to say there can be a mature Christianity, like you're saying, where you kind of own the whole story. And this whole narrative of God versus the devil that's been going along for so long, I think in a sense a mature Christianity would grow out of it and replace it with a love story, a bit like the prodigal son. And of course, as the verse in Isaiah, darkness and light to me are both alike. We have
Right. Yeah.
Anyway.
There is a tradition of that, yeah. Okay, now I want to go on and ask an equally difficult and dangerous question, which is about Islam. You raised the question of, how Islam looks at Moses. I mean, I've done a commentary on the Quran in the last few years in some detail. I've looked at every single surah in depth, and I've analysed, the Arabic, and I put them into historical context. And I've also read a lot of literature, contemporary literature, about Muhammad and reanalysing Muhammad's career. So the question I want to ask is, well, if you're going to ask this about Moses and Christ, was Muhammad secretly a Satanist? If you're going to ask it about Marx, there is some evidence. If you look at Muhammad's career, there's been a lot of the same kind of extremism and fanaticism. And if you add up all the people that have been killed in wars by Muslims over the centuries, we're talking millions. If you're going to grumble at Stalin and Mao, the figures actually that Islam are responsible for are the same. The numbers of temples and artworks destroyed. In Muhammad's own life, anyone that opposed him ultimately could be killed. What seems to have happened in Muhammad's life, as I've been doing the commentary on the Quran, is as he gained more power, as he went from being a simple homespun prophet in his early days in Mecca, when the surahs were quite benign and very interfaith, when he got power in Medina, and he accumulated lots of money and wealth and wives, and he became a military leader. They started raiding caravans, and he would benefit immensely from military campaigning personally. And the Quran changes its tone. It becomes a sort of self-justificatory, tract that can justify this kind of behaviour. And so there's a question about whether, if you disallow other people to have access to prophecy, if anybody sets up shop as the prophet and nobody else is allowed to do any prophecy and you're all delegitimized, isn't that quite what we might call satanic? That's an illegitimate stealing of everyone else's right to access spirit, I would argue. In Judaism, everyone is called to prophetic witness, also in Christianity and in most other religions. Islam seems to be the only one that I know of that says no, prophecy is shut down, it's all finished, Muhammad's the only and final one. Okay, I'll pause there. Burning question.
The true Islam is different from what you see today.
Right.
James and John, they went to a Samaritan village asking them to get ready to receive Jesus. They said they don't want to know him. So they went back to Jesus, put that village on fire as Elijah did. He said, you don't know what spirit ye are of. I have come to do the will of my Father, not my will. And that is Islam, inshallah. And this Islam is of Inshmullah. You understand Inshmullah?
It's, I would agree with you that it's not really an auspicious kind of Islam.
And the same Islam was preached by second coming of Jesus, Nanak, that go by the will of Allah, not by your own will.
Okay, well that's
this Islam
interesting.
of Inshmullah is creating problem. It's a moon and star. Allah is sun, primary source of light. He is not moon and star.
You've obviously done a lot of thinking about this, and it's very interesting.
Yeah,
I'll comment later. I hope when I continue, you'll find hopefully a few other clues here.
With regards to the Prophet Muhammad, could this not be more just the sort of an example of how extreme power and wealth can just quite simply corrupt people and cause greed, much like we see in a lot of capitalist society at the moment? You see these people who are ridiculously wealthy, far wealthier than they'll ever need.
Certain MPs come to mind.
Certainly, but people who are ridiculously wealthy, you don't need any more money, but it's simply it goes to their head almost.
Sure.
And then obviously using a very influential position.
Human corruptibility, I think, is a tragic factor of history that has to be factored in here.
Not just simply be down just simply the corruptibility rather than
Sure.
It's a change in the sort of change in spiritual thinking.
Well, I think it may be a bit of both, because the thing is, if you're setting up as a prophet or a religious teacher and are invoking angels and archangels to justify what you're doing, then I think you have to withstand the scrutiny of critical comparative diabology. You know, you've got to stand up to that. Mandy, can I go on a bit? Or?
I just want you to help me. I'm getting... I think I'm hearing you sort of using the word, was he a Satanist? And saying maybe he was because he behaved badly, whereas I thought a Satanist was somebody who thought that evil was personified or was outside themselves, you know, and influencing them.
Worshipping them.
Yeah.
Worshipping Satan, yeah. Now, I'm using the term in different ways, and historically the term has been used in different ways. One question that one can ask is, if somebody, I mean, obviously there's no way that Moses or Jesus or Muhammad went around secretly thinking, I'm a Satanist, I'm just fooling them all. You know, obviously they weren't doing that. But what I'm asking is unconsciously, without being aware of it, because transpersonal history is looking at the unconscious dynamics, the psychohistory of people, right? And I think we've got to ask, the thought worlds these people were coming from, was Satan, you know, obsessed? So, and Zoroaster too, right? So I think it's a legitimate question to ask, was in their unconscious mind, you know, this element coming out, which can explain some of the aftershocks, right? Just as, I mean, I don't think Christ in his, whatever have dreamt that someday somebody would torture somebody else in his name to save his soul, like the Inquisition used to do, you know? Or Ivan the Terrible used to torture people in the dungeons in the Kremlin in the name of Christ to save their soul. Bit of pain now. If you repent, it's better, or you go to hellfire forever. And the Spanish Inquisition did the same. Jesus wouldn't have wanted that, but in a sense, because of the energy that he set up, that's what happens. What I'm asking is, of course, Muhammad in his right mind would never have wanted what's happened. You know, but I read a thing recently that some terrorist cell in Canada, where I partly come from, had been looking at blowing the Yellowstone geyser. It only takes a little explosion, and it would destroy North America if you knocked the lid off. So, you know, now we've got people in the name of Islam, in the name of Allah, thinking of literally blowing the world up, as if that's what Allah would want. So I'm trying to say, well, look, we really have to get serious about this and ask the psychohistory behind this guy, because it's totally irrational. So, anyway, I mean, Muhammad himself would say he's an anti-Satanist, and the whole of Islam that he created was a strategy to defeat Satan. And the Muslim terrorists that are fighting, the Al-Qaeda hardcore, the ISIS people, they believe they're in the front line of the anti-satanic battleground, because hardcore Islam thinks there's a war to, you know, the death between Allah and Satan. I'm saying that's a bit oversimplistic. As I said, Ibn Wahhab wrote tracts against Satan, and I think that if you psychologize this narrative, this diabolic story, we're actually going to destroy ourselves. If you take the psychological view that Satan is an impulse inside all of us, it's the dark, it's the shadow, it's a throwback from our primordial survival mechanisms where we learned to be violent when we had to be, you know. Then the war between God and Satan is going to end in the destruction of mankind, you know. So that's the problem. So the question we can ask then is, how can we heal this? Instead of sitting back and watching this tragic narrative happen, I think I'd love to organise an interfaith conference on the devil in Medina and invite, you know, great theologians from the Islamic faith, the Jewish, the Christian, the Sikh, the Hindu, the Buddhist, and let's get this conversation going. Instead of fighting and killing each other in the name of this mission, let's get on the same mission. Another question I've got. About ancient Greek pagans. You know, Alexander the Great was seen by some people as the son of God. Unbelievable accomplishments and all that. But on the other, he was seen as a devil by the Persians. He destroyed Persepolis. He was debauched. He had drunken orgies most nights. He must be a devil. Were the ancient Greeks? Can we say the ancient Greeks were devil worshippers? Therefore, was Prometheus the ancestor of this archetype? I'm a Hellenist myself. I mean, I love philosophy. And as I said, I don't think the Greeks saw things in such black and white ways. I think Alexander was flawed. He knew that he had a problem. He had a drinking problem. He had a power problem, a violence problem. He turned bad at the end, just as we discussed. When power, corrupts, and he turned on Parmenion, his father's great general. There's a tragedy of Alexander's story, but it doesn't. I think the narrative that emerges is that people have this flaw within us, as Shakespeare pointed out. The anti-hero of the tragedy is tragic because they're human. So I said before that if you go back to Bronze Age, I think this is why archaeology is so important. I still want to be a professor of archaeology. It's the most important thing. If we can trace all this stuff back to the ancient Bronze Age and the Neolithic, as Ryan Eisler and other people want us to, I think we'll find that the narratives all start going wrong when we invent these texts, these alphabetic scripts, which claim to be the only truth. And we lose the spirit, if you want, which I think Neolithic society had. We lose the goddess tradition as a friendly thing, not something to be afraid of. And I think it's very interesting that Marx did his doctoral thesis on ancient Greek philosophy and Greek materialism. I think he was a Hellenist as well, Marx, which is why he said Prometheus is the patron saint of all philosophers. I'd agree with him in that. So, anyway, look, I've tried to present why I think this field of comparative diabology is important from a peace studies angle. I've asked some difficult questions. What's the answer? The final answer? Well, I think the answer is actually virtue ethics. I think we have to go back to Aristotle, and if whatever Satan is, whether it's a force, an energy, something in the unconscious, an accumulation of fear or whatever, I think there is an antidote to it, and I think that's philosophy and the cultivation of small virtues. Aristotle said virtue is a habit that can be developed. Every time you choose not to react with anger, every time you choose a loving response, every time you choose kindness, in a sense you're adding to that collective realization. Just one final observation. Krishnamurti was groomed for the role, as you know, of Maitreya, right? Which was the Buddhist version of the Sayashant. And then he renounced it. He said, I can't carry that light because it's in all of us. There's a collective Maitreya, there's a collective Sayashant. I would say as a philosopher that's the antidote to Satanism. And what we should do as inheritors of the Enlightenment is challenge that kind of that particularism of the Satan narrative. The importance of comparative diabology as a strategy in that is to counterpose against that oversimplification and Enlightenment story, which can explain what they're doing, and I would argue that the terrorist is the modern Satanist without realising it. And that's why, as a peace studies scholar, I've presented this talk to you today, which I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you.